different in October. As it swept through the trees on the edge of Greystone, it carried with it whispers that made the townsfolk uneasy. Some claimed it was the wind shifting through the dead leaves, but Clara Monroe knew better. There was something wrong with those woods, something ancient that lingered there, waiting for the fall to bring it back to life. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just beginning to dip behind the thick line of oaks that marked the border of Black Hollow. The small town nestled against the forest seemed peaceful enough, with the smell of harvest fires and fresh apples drifting through the air. But Clara couldn't shake the sense of dread as she walked home from school, her boots crunching over the brittle leaves. She glanced over her shoulder at the woods, shivering as the air grew colder. There was a story her grandmother used to tell. A story about Black Hollow and the thing that lived there. A figure cloaked in shadows who came out once a year, when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest, on Halloween night. The legend had been passed down through generations, whispered in fear but rarely spoken aloud. Clara had always thought it was just that, a story. But this Halloween felt different. The wind seemed to carry warnings, and the shadows in the forest felt too close. As Clara neared her house, she spotted Jacob sitting on her front porch, his long legs dangling over the edge as he whittled a stick with a pocket knife. He looked up as she approached, his freckled face splitting into a grin. "Thought I'd walk you home," he said. "Heard the wind's picking up again." Clara smirked. "You just don't like walking alone." Jacob shrugged. "Maybe. But with Halloween coming, can you blame me?" She sat down next to him, glancing toward the woods. "Do you think it's true?" she asked quietly. "The stories." Jacob's grin faded, and he looked out toward Black Hollow. "My grandpa used to say there's truth in every legend, no matter how old. He never talked much about the Hollow, though. It spooked him. You remember what happened to your cousin Danny, don't you?" Clara's stomach twisted. Danny had vanished when he was 8 years old. It was nearly a decade ago now, but the pain still sat raw in her family, like an open wound that never healed. One moment Danny had been walking home from a Halloween festival, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the night. The whole town had searched for him, but no one found a trace. There had been other children over the years too, and though no one said it out loud, everyone knew what took them. The wind picked up again, and for just a moment, Clara swore she heard something. A faint voice carried on the breeze, soft but unmistakable. She froze, listening harder. The voice was distant, like a child's cry, coming from the direction of the woods. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her heart pounding. Jacob frowned. "Hear what?" Clara stared into the darkening trees. A voice from the hollow. Jacob stood, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the shadowy woods. "I didn't hear anything, you sure?" Clara nodded, swallowing hard. "It sounded like a kid, crying." Jacob hesitated. "We should head inside. It's probably just the wind playing tricks on you." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the edge of the woods. The wind moaned through the trees again, and this time she heard it more clearly. A soft, breathy whisper, her name wrapped in the wind like a secret. "Clara." She gasped, grabbing Jacob's arm. "We need to go," she muttered, dragging him toward the door. As they stepped inside and slammed the door shut behind them, the whispering stopped. But Clara knew the woods weren't done with her. Not yet. The wind was only the beginning. Halloween was coming, and the figure from Black Hollow would be coming with it. Halloween was still 2 weeks away when Tommy Granger vanished, It happened on a cloudy Wednesday just after sunset. The air had turned sharp with the coming chill of winter, and a thick mist rolled through the streets, clinging to the ground like ghostly fingers. Clara was helping her mother peel potatoes for dinner when the knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Granger, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched at the doorway. "Have you seen Tommy?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "He was playing out front and now he's gone. He won't answer when I call." Clara's mother dropped the potato she was holding, her face blanching. "How long has he been missing?" she asked, rushing to the woman's side. "Only a few minutes," Mrs. Granger replied, breathless. "But it's getting dark and he's never run off like this before. Please, can you help me?" Clara stood frozen as her mother pulled on a coat and hurried out with Mrs. Granger into the night. She knew exactly what was going through everyone's minds. No one said it out loud. No one dared. But the whispers would begin soon. Black Hollow. Another child lost. "I'm coming with you," Clara announced, pulling her own coat from the hook. Her mother opened her mouth to protest, but Clara didn't wait to listen. She was already out the door, Jacob falling into step beside her as she ran down the street. People were gathering in front of the Granger's house, lanterns in hand, their faces drawn with worry. Tommy was only 6, a bright-eyed boy with a crooked grin, who loved to chase frogs and play hide-and-seek. But no matter how hard they searched, there were no signs of him. Not a footprint, not a single clue as to where he might have gone. Clara felt her stomach knot. It was happening again. Just like Danny. Just like the others. "Clara," Jacob said softly, pulling her aside. His face was pale, his usual easygoing nature gone. "Do you think this is it? Is it happening again?" She didn't answer right away, her mind racing with the implications. "I don't know," she whispered, staring at the dark line of trees at the far end of town. The hollow loomed beyond, shrouded in fog, as if it were waiting. As the night wore on and the townspeople combed the streets, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air was thick, heavy with something she couldn't name, and every rustle of the wind made her heart race. They searched until their lanterns burned low. But by midnight, hope had turned to dread. Tommy was gone. Back at the Monroe house, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts spinning. She stared down at the old journal she'd found the week before in her grandmother's attic, the one with yellowing pages and brittle leather binding. She hadn't paid much attention to it at first, but now, with Tommy's disappearance hanging over the town, it felt more important than ever. Her grandmother had written it years ago, before Clara was born. It was full of strange notes, some of them almost unreadable, scribbled in the margins alongside stories and warnings about Black Hollow. Her grandmother had always been a little odd, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the journal might hold the key to understanding the legend. Flipping through the pages, she came across an entry that made her blood run cold. It described a night long ago, when children from Greystone had gone missing one by one. Each time, it was on Halloween night. And each time, the children had been seen playing near the edge of the woods before they disappeared. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she read the final line. "They are not lost. They are taken." "Clara!" Jacob's voice cut through the silence, and she jumped, nearly knocking over the lantern on the table. He stood in the doorway, his face grim. "They've called off the search for tonight." She nodded, closing the journal with shaking hands. "Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we're in trouble. I think it started again." Jacob's eyes darkened. "We need to figure this out. Before Halloween, Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The hollow had taken Tommy, she was sure of it. But why? And how? Whatever it was that haunted the woods, it was ancient, and it was far from finished. Halloween was still coming, and the legend of Black Hollow was far from over. The morning after Tommy's disappearance, Greystone woke to a thick fog clinging to the streets, muffling sound and sight. Whispers traveled fast through the town, carried on the wind like rumors of death. Tommy's parents had barely slept, and the sheriff was planning another search, but Clara knew deep down that no search party would find him. Not unless they looked in the one place no one dared to go. Black Hollow. Clara and Jacob met in front of the old library as soon as the town bell struck noon. The fog still lingered, swirling in lazy circles as if mocking the search efforts. Inside the library, the smell of old paper and dust filled the air. Mrs. Finch, the librarian, greeted them with a tired nod but didn't ask what they were looking for. The whole town felt on edge, the usual warmth of familiarity replaced with unease. Clara had brought the journal, tucking it into her coat pocket. She led Jacob to a corner table, and they sat surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten history. Pulling out the journal, she flipped to the entry she had found the night before. Jacob leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. "They are not lost. They are taken," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. He sat back, rubbing his chin. "Taken by what?" "That's what we need to find out," Clara said. "My grandmother knew something about the Hollow, something people have forgotten. She always said that the stories were warnings, not just old tales to scare kids. Look at this." She turned to another page, this one filled with strange symbols and notes in her grandmother's handwriting. Some of the symbols were familiar to Clara, old protection charms her grandmother used to hang around the house during Halloween. But others were more cryptic, tied to things far darker. "There's a name here," Clara whispered, pointing to a scrawled note. "Eliza Blackwood." Jacob frowned. "That name sounds familiar. Wasn't she the widow who used to live out by the edge of town? Near the Hollow?" Clara nodded. "I remember my parents talking about her when I was little. She disappeared years ago, but there were rumors that her family was cursed. They had some kind of connection to the Hollow." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "If anyone knows something about this legend, it might be her, if she's still alive." Clara swallowed. "There's only one way to find out. We need to find her house." Jacob hesitated. "Do you really think it's a good idea to go out that way? Especially after what happened to Tommy?" Clara's jaw tightened. "If we don't, more kids are going to disappear. You saw the way the fog is hanging over the town. Halloween is getting closer. We have to know what we're dealing with." Jacob sighed but nodded. "All right, we'll go. But let's be careful." By late afternoon, they were standing at the edge of town, where the fields gave way to thick woods. The path that led toward the Blackwood house was overgrown, the trees leaning in as if trying to block their way. It felt colder here, the kind of cold that crept into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. The wind whistled through the branches, carrying with it a faint, eerie hum. "This is it," Clara said, her breath visible in the chill air. "It's just up ahead." Jacob glanced around nervously. "I don't like this." As they walked deeper into the woods, the air seemed to grow heavier, thick with the weight of something unseen. The fog twisted through the trees, and Clara could feel the Hollow's presence growing closer with each step. But they pressed on until at last they saw the outline of the Blackwood house. It was more a ruin than a home now, its roof sagging, windows shattered, and ivy crawling up the walls like skeletal hands. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking with each gust of wind. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Jacob muttered. "We've come this far," Clara replied, pushing open the door with a groan. Inside, the house was dark and smelled of mildew. Dust covered every surface, but it was clear someone had lived there once. Faded pictures hung on the walls, and an old chair sat near a cold fireplace. "Look around for anything about Black Hollow," Clara whispered. They split up, searching through piles of old papers, books, and trinkets. After several minutes, Jacob called out, "Clara, over here!" She hurried over and found Jacob holding an old leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. It wasn't the book itself that caught her attention, though. It was the name scrawled inside the front cover. Eliza Blackwood. Opening it, Clara skimmed through the first few pages until she found something that made her heart race. A detailed account of the history of Black Hollow. Eliza had written about the ancient curse tied to the Hollow, a curse that demanded a life every year. And worse, she wrote about a figure cloaked in darkness who came to collect the children. The last entry read, "The Hollow will take until it is broken, but no one can break it, not without sacrifice." Clara's blood ran cold as she read the final line. They weren't just fighting an old legend. They were up against something much older and far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Halloween was just days away, and they were running out of time. Halloween crept closer, and with it, the air in Greystone grew heavier, more oppressive. The fog never fully lifted. It clung to the streets and to the houses, wrapping itself around the town like a shroud. People barely spoke above whispers now, their gazes shifting nervously to the woods as if expecting the worst. Clara could feel the town's fear, and it gnawed at her, twisting her stomach into knots. The journal from Eliza Blackwood hadn't provided the answers they needed, only more questions. The curse, the figure cloaked in shadows, and the ominous mention of sacrifice haunted Clara's thoughts. She barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with dark woods and the echo of children's laughter turning into screams. On the eve of Halloween, as Clara walked home from the library with Jacob, the wind began to howl, pushing the mist into eerie, writhing shapes. The fog thickened, curling into ghostly tendrils that licked at their legs. She pulled her coat tighter, the chill biting through the fabric, and quickened her pace. "Do you feel that?" Jacob asked suddenly, his voice taut with unease. Clara nodded. The air felt wrong, heavy with something otherworldly. A low sound rose in the distance, almost like a moan carried on the wind. Clara's heart raced as she glanced toward the woods. There, in the shifting fog, something moved. "Jacob," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "Look." Through the swirling mist, a figure began to take shape. It was faint at first, just a blur of shadow against the trees. But as they watched, it grew clearer. Tall, gaunt figure, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured by a hood. The figure seemed to drift, not walk, its movements unnatural, as if it were gliding just above the ground. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary fog. This was it. The ghost of Black Hollow. Jacob took a step back, his eyes wide. "We need to go." But Clara stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the figure. The wind carried a faint voice toward her, soft and breathy like a distant whisper. It was calling her name. "Clara." The voice was so soft that for a moment, she thought she might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, filled with sorrow and something darker. Despair. "Clara, help us." Jacob grabbed her hand, yanking her back toward the road. "Come on!" he urged, his voice shaking. Clara stumbled after him, her heart pounding, but she couldn't shake the voice. It echoed in her mind, that haunting, pleading cry, "Help us!" When they reached her house, Jacob slammed the door shut behind them, both of them gasping for breath. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside it was quiet. Too quiet. "What was that?" Jacob asked, his face pale. Clara didn't answer right away. She sank into a chair, her mind spinning. The figure, the voice. None of it made sense. But somehow, she knew it wasn't a warning. It was something else. A cry for help. The children that had been taken. They were still there, somewhere, trapped in the hollow. "Eliza's journal," Clara said suddenly, her voice hoarse. "It said the hollow wouldn't stop. Not until the curse is broken." Jacob frowned. "But how do we stop it? We don't even know what it wants." Clara shook her head, feeling the weight of the journal's final entry pressing down on her. Not without sacrifice. She didn't know what that meant, but it terrified her. "We have to go back," she said finally. "Tomorrow, to Black Hollow. We need to find the source of this curse." Jacob stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Are you serious? After what we just saw? Clara, that thing, whatever it is, it's dangerous." "I know," she whispered, "but we don't have a choice. If we don't do something, more kids are going to disappear. And next time, we might not be able to stop it." Jacob looked away, his face tight with fear. But after a long moment, he nodded. "All right, tomorrow, we'll go. But we need to be careful." Clara sat in silence as the wind outside roared, carrying with it the faint, haunting whispers of the lost children. Halloween was almost here, and the figure in the fog was already hunting. Whatever lay in Black Hollow, they had to face it. Because if they didn't, the legend wouldn't just be a story anymore. It would become their reality, and Greystone would be lost to the fog forever. Halloween arrived shrouded in a heavy, unnatural mist. The entire town of Greystone felt smothered by it, the fog creeping through the streets like some malevolent force, hiding everything beyond a few feet ahead. Clara and Jacob stood at the edge of town, staring into the woods that led to Black Hollow. It was time. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her grandmother's journal. In the early light, the trees ahead seemed to shift, almost breathing, as though the hollow itself was alive. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising fear. They had no choice now. Tommy was gone, and every instinct told her that more would follow if they didn't act. "Are you ready?" Jacob asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind that whipped through the leaves. "No," Clara admitted, "but we don't have a choice." They exchanged a grim glance before stepping into the woods, the towering trees immediately closing in around them. The path ahead twisted and turned, overgrown with gnarled roots and brambles that seemed eager to trip them. As they walked deeper, the air grew thick with the same eerie stillness Clara had felt days before, the same oppressive quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The mist seemed to grow denser the farther they went, and soon it was hard to see even a few steps ahead. Clara could barely make out the outline of Jacob beside her. Their breaths came in quick, nervous puffs as they pushed forward. "This place feels wrong," Jacob whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Like it's not natural." Clara nodded, the weight of the hollow pressing down on her with every step. It felt like walking into another world, one where the rules of life and death didn't quite apply. They were no longer just wandering into an old, cursed valley. They were crossing into something darker. Suddenly, a soft, rustling sound broke the silence. Clara stopped, holding her breath. The noise came again, this time closer. Her heart thudded in her chest as she strained to see through the fog, the world around her thick with shadows. "Did you hear that?" Jacob asked, his voice low. Clara nodded, stepping forward cautiously. "It's coming from ahead." They moved slowly, every footstep feeling heavier as they neared the source of the noise. Then, through the mist, Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. Shapes, small and frail, wandering between the trees. They were children, their faces pale and eyes hollow, drifting aimlessly through the woods as if caught in some kind of trance. "Tommy," Jacob whispered in horror, recognizing the small boy at the front of the group. He moved to call out, but Clara grabbed his arm, shaking her head. "Wait," she whispered. "Something's not right." She watched the children move, their bodies transparent, fading in and out of the mist like ghosts. Their expressions were blank, as though they no longer saw the world around them. It was as if they were no longer truly alive, but neither were they dead. "The curse," Clara murmured, remembering the journal's final warning. "They are not lost. They are taken." The children were trapped, caught between life and death, wandering the hollow like lost souls. And Tommy, he was among them. Suddenly, the mist shifted, and from the shadows stepped the figure they had seen the night before. Cloaked in darkness, its hood obscuring any trace of a face, it glided toward the children with an otherworldly grace. The figure reached out with long, skeletal hands, ushering the children deeper into the woods. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was the figure from the legend, the one who came every year to take the children into the hollow. "We have to follow it," Clara whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. "It's leading them somewhere." Jacob's face paled, but he nodded. Together they crept through the fog, careful to stay far enough behind the ghostly figure. The children moved without a sound, their small feet barely disturbing the leaves beneath them. The path wound deeper into the hollow, until at last they came to a dark clearing. At the center stood an ancient, crumbling stone altar, surrounded by dead trees, whose branches twisted upward like gnarled claws. The figure led the children to the altar, and gestured for them to kneel. Clara felt a wave of dread crash over her. This was it. The heart of Black Hollow. The place where the curse had begun. The figure turned slowly, its hood still concealing its face, and Clara realized with a jolt that it was looking directly at her. She froze, her blood turning to ice as the figure raised one hand, beckoning her forward. "You were warned!" A voice echoed in her mind, cold and hollow. "Now, it is your turn." Before Clara could react, the fog around the clearing began to swirl violently, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. She grabbed Jacob's arm, her voice shaking. "We have to stop this. Now." Jacob stared at her, wide-eyed as the figure moved closer. "How?" Clara swallowed hard, clutching the journal to her chest. The answer was here, somewhere in the curse, buried in the secrets of the hollow. But she feared that to break it, they would have to give something up, something they could never get back. The fog tightened its grip, and the figure's voice echoed once more. "The hollow demands a sacrifice." The air around the clearing grew thick with an unnatural chill, the fog swirling faster, closing in like a living thing. The skeletal figure from Black Hollow stood at the center of the ancient stone altar, its shadow stretching across the ground like a curse. Clara's heart pounded as she clutched her grandmother's journal in trembling hands, the words inside echoing in her mind. Not without sacrifice. The ghostly children, Tommy among them, stood in eerie silence, their faces pale and distant, as if they were no longer entirely themselves. The figure raised one long, bony hand, and the fog seemed to pulse, tightening its grip around the clearing. Clara felt Jacob's hand on her arm, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of here, Clara. This thing, it's too powerful." But Clara shook her head, her eyes fixed on the figure. "We can't leave them, Jacob. Tommy, all those kids, they're trapped. This is what the Hollow wants. It takes and it keeps taking until someone stops it. Then what do we do?" Jacob's voice was filled with desperation. "How do we stop something this old, this monstrous?" Clara swallowed hard, her eyes drifting to the altar. The answer had to be here, hidden in the curse's origins. She opened the journal again, flipping frantically through the brittle pages until she found the passage she had read before. "The Hollow will take until it is broken. The cycle of sacrifice must be fulfilled. The price..." The ink was smeared, but she could make out enough. Her stomach dropped. The price wasn't just a sacrifice of life. It was a trade. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You don't want them!" she called out, her words shaky but firm. "You want something else, don't you? Someone else." The figure's hood shifted, and though she couldn't see its face, she felt its gaze settle on her. The air around her grew colder, and the figure spoke without moving its lips, its voice like the whisper of dead leaves. "The Hollow hungers. The children are its offering. But there is another way." Clara's hands tightened on the journal, her pulse racing. "Tell me what you want." For a moment, the fog around them stilled, as though the Hollow itself was considering her words. The figure's voice came again, slow and deliberate. "The curse was born from a betrayal, a pact made and broken long ago. A blood debt paid every year. But one soul, one willing soul, can end it." Clara felt the weight of the words crash down on her. She understood now. The figure, the Hollow, had been feeding off the children for generations, claiming them to satisfy an ancient bargain made by someone in the past. But to stop the cycle, someone had to offer themselves willingly. Not a child, but someone who understood the cost. "No," Jacob said, his voice hard. "Clara, no. You can't be serious." Clara turned to him, her eyes full of fear but also determination. "It's the only way, Jacob. If I don't do this, the Hollow will keep coming. More kids will be taken. Tommy, all of them. I have to end it." Jacob shook his head, grabbing her arm. "There has to be another way. We'll find it. We'll figure it out together. You can't just offer yourself like that." Clara's throat tightened as she looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want to, but what choice do we have? The curse won't break unless someone makes a sacrifice, a willing sacrifice. I can't let more children disappear." Jacob's grip loosened, his face pale with grief. "Clara, please." The fog thickened again, the figure moving closer. Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding as she faced it. "Take me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take me and let them go." For a moment there was silence. The figure hovered before her, its hollow voice echoing in the stillness. "You offer yourself freely?" Clara nodded, her hands shaking. "Yes, I offer myself." The fog swirled around her, cold as ice, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Clara felt the weight of the Hollow's dark power settling over her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, pulling her toward the altar. She closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. Then, all at once, the wind stopped. The figure paused, its shadow retreating slightly, as if considering her offer. Slowly, the fog began to lift, unraveling from the clearing like a web being pulled apart. The children, still standing in a daze, began to stir, their ghostly forms growing more solid. Tommy blinked, confusion in his eyes as if waking from a long nightmare. The figure lowered its hood, revealing nothing but a black void where a face should have been. "The Hollow accepts," it whispered, its voice hollow and ancient. "The curse is broken." Clara felt a surge of relief wash over her, but it was fleeting. As the fog receded, the ground beneath the altar cracked, a dark, gaping hole opening up. A cold wind whipped through the clearing, and the figure began to dissolve into the mist, leaving only the echo of its voice. "The debt is paid." Clara stumbled back as the fog vanished completely, the air suddenly clear and sharp. She gasped, feeling the weight of what she had just done, but there was no time to dwell on it. The children, Tommy, all of them, were free. The Hollow had released them, but at what cost? Jacob rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight embrace, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it, Clara. You broke the curse." Clara nodded, but inside she knew the truth. The curse might be broken, but the Hollow would never forget. It had taken its sacrifice, and in doing so, it had left a part of itself with her. As they walked back to Greystone, the weight of the night hung heavy in the air. The children were saved, but Clara's fate was sealed. The Hollow had accepted her offer, and deep down, Clara knew that one day it would come to collect.